Imagine waking to a morning that looks exactly like the one before it, and the one before that. Snow has buried the fields for as long as anyone can remember. The grain stores that should be feeding a village until harvest are already empty, and it is not yet midwinter. In the cottages, children have gone quiet in a way that unsettles their mothers more than crying ever did. Livestock stand frozen in their stalls, too weak to be let out even if there were pasture to lead them to. Somewhere beyond the hills, a king is trying to decide what to do about a catastrophe he does not yet understand, in a world that has never faced anything quite like it. This is not a single bad season. This is the moment an entire civilization begins to suspect that the sky itself has turned against it. For centuries, medieval Europe had lived inside a fragile bargain with its climate. A run of relatively mild, stable weather, now known to climatologists as the medieval warm period, had allowed population and farmland to expand together, pushing cultivation into marginal soils and thinner margins of survival. Nobody living through that expansion could have known they were building a civilization on borrowed weather. So how could one winter threaten an entire continent? Why did kings, with all their armies and treasuries, prove powerless to stop it? And why, in village after village, did ordinary people become convinced the end of the world had finally arrived? The answers unfold slowly, because that is exactly how the disaster itself unfolded. If you find stories like this one compelling, stay with this channel because we go looking for the moments history almost forgot. The rains began in the spring of 1315, and they did not stop. Chroniclers across England, France, and the Low Countries described skies that would not clear, fields turned to standing water, and roads reduced to impassable mud. Modern tree ring and ice core evidence points to a broader shift already underway, a cooling of the North Atlantic climate that would later be called the Little Ice Age, and 1315 sits at its opening act. Wheat and rye, the calorie backbone of the medieval diet, rotted in waterlogged soil before they could ripen. Hay could not be cut and dried, which meant no fodder for the animals that pulled the plows and provided the milk and meat a village depended on through winter. By autumn, granaries that should have held a year's surplus held barely enough for a season. Grain prices in some regions are recorded as climbing to several times their normal level within months, a shift visible in surviving manorial accounts and royal purchasing records. Salt, essential for preserving what meat could still be slaughtered, also became scarce because the same relentless rain interfered with the evaporation ponds used to produce it. Everything that made a medieval winter survivable was failing at once. But the worst was still to come. The winter of 1315 into 1316 arrived early and struck hard, and the harvest that followed in 1316 was in many regions even worse than the first. 2 consecutive ruined harvests meant there was no reserve left to draw on. This is the detail that separates the Great Famine from an ordinary bad year. Medieval agricultural systems were built with some tolerance for a single failed season. They were not built to survive 2 in a row, let alone the run of poor harvests that would stretch into 1317 in parts of northern Europe. Contemporary chroniclers left behind unflinching descriptions of what came next. Writers of the period recorded reports of extreme hunger, driving some communities to consume animals never normally eaten, including, in the most desperate accounts, dogs and horses, and even claims of parents unable to feed their children. Historians treat the most extreme reports, including rumors of cannibalism, with appropriate caution, since chroniclers of the period were prone to moralizing and exaggeration in the face of catastrophe. What is not in dispute, because it appears consistently across tax records, mortality patterns, and monastic registers, is mortality rose sharply across northern Europe between 1315 and 1317, with some regions losing a significant share of their population to starvation and the diseases that stalk alongside it. Weakened by hunger, people became vulnerable to illness that a well-fed body might have shrugged off. Dysentery and other intestinal disease spread through communities already thinned by malnutrition. Livestock did not escape either. A great cattle panzootic swept through Europe in these same years, killing off the draft animals farmers needed to plow what fields remained workable, compounding a crisis that was already feeding on itself. Kings were not idle, but their tools were limited and often made things worse. Edward II of England attempted to fix grain prices by royal decree, an effort chroniclers record as having little practical effect, since it did nothing to increase the actual supply of food and may have discouraged merchants from bringing what grain they had to market at all. Across the Channel, French royal administration faced similar pressure, as towns pleaded for relief that the crown could not fully provide. This was a crisis that exceeded the administrative capacity of any medieval government, however capable, because there was no functioning system for moving surplus food across a continent where there was no surplus left to move. For many, the only remaining explanation lay in the church. Chroniclers described crowded processions and penitential rites, congregations searching for the sin that must have provoked such divine anger, because a world this broken felt like it had to mean something. Monasteries, which often kept the most detailed harvest and almsgiving records of the period, opened what stores they had to the desperate, though even religious houses were not immune to the shortages surrounding them. If there is one detail from this story that has stayed with you, this is a good place to pause and share which part struck you the most, because it tells us a great deal about what still resonates in a catastrophe 7 centuries gone. Recovery, when it finally came around 1317 and into 1318, was neither swift nor complete. Populations that had been reduced took a generation or more to recover in some regions, and the psychological and economic aftershocks lingered far longer than the famine itself. Some historians argue the Great Famine weakened the resilience of European populations in ways that would matter again a generation later, when a far deadlier catastrophe arrived. That, however, is a story for another time. What the Great Famine reveals, more than any single statistic, is how narrow the margin was between a thriving medieval civilization and a starving one. It took 2 bad harvests, not a war, not an invasion, simply weather, to bring kingdoms to their knees and to make ordinary people believe the world itself was ending. Picture again that morning we began with, the empty granary, the silent children, the farmer staring at a sky that would not relent. Now you understand what he could not have known standing there, that the ground beneath an entire civilization had already begun to shift, and that the winter he was living through was not an ending at all, but the opening chapter of a much longer, much harder age.